Thanks, Claudia. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Minister Hugh and the Ministry of Commerce, Planning and Infrastructure, it gives me great pleasure which is aimed at assisting you to become compliant to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing laws and regulations. I want to commend all of you for attending today and being proactive to ensure that you have vital information and the know-how so that your businesses can meet local and international obligations. The Department of Commerce and Investment, the Ministry of CPI, and indeed the Government of the Cayman Islands take seriously threats posed by money laundering and terrorist financing to our designated non-financial business and profession, our DNFBPs. These illegal activities have the power to corrupt legitimate business, undermine the integrity of DNFBPs, and damage the reputation. Sorry, guys. And damage the reputation of businesses, companies, and even this country. Your businesses are potential vehicles for cleansing ill-gotten gains, and so it is important hopefully that doesn't do that again. So your businesses are potential vehicles for cleansing ill-gotten gains, and so it is important that as a regulator, the Department of Commerce and Investment works with you to develop sound AML, CFT practices and measures as part of your operations. The Cayman Islands is under the microscope at this time, but the government remains committed to maintaining global standards when it comes to money laundering and terrorist financing. Our action plans show how seriously we are taking this effort and how we will remain compliant in addressing the recommendations made by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. I wish to express my gratitude to the DCI team for being ever ready to facilitate these workshops. I am sure that this session will energize and equip you all as participants to undertake your responsibilities. Before I close, I want to remind all of you to reach out to DCI, reach out to us anytime you need further support. We are here to guide and support you. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a good training session this evening. Thank you.
To start us off this afternoon, we have the Director of the Anti-Money Laundering Unit, Mr. Francis Arana, who is going to start us out by talking about the National Risk Assessment and how this applies to you. And I'm going to try and get his presentation on the screen, but I know Francis is always ready, so he will get started without any issues. So, Francis, I'll just turn it now.
Yes.
You have the clicker?
Yes, I do.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for spending the time with us. This is late afternoon, and I was going to say, well, because we are anticipating a recession that no food, but then I saw food over that side, so I take it back. But I'm the head of the Anti-Money Laundering Unit and was integrally involved in the National Risk Assessment for the Cayman Islands. So I'm just going to speak to you a little bit about the NRA without the presentation. So that's going to be very interesting. I just wish that it was up but let me start and then we'll probably just go back. When it comes to a national risk assessment or understanding risks, there are different levels that you have to be conscious of. And I will say this broadly because certainly within the AML CFT framework, and you will hear a lot of acronyms now, I'm certain that you know what AML CFT is. Anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. And of late, you also have combating the financing of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction CFP, let's just say. So there's a lot of acronyms, and what has happened in most international settings and in most jurisdictions, they've been very good at anti-money laundering because the financial institutions have been familiar with that for a number of years. You will notice of late that jurisdictions are taking on the supervision of DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and profession. Cayman came to it also belatedly because when the standards changed, there was a greater emphasis on not only technical compliance, whether or not you have the laws, regulations, guidance, policies, and procedures in place, but whether or not you are implementing them in practice. I remember one of the FATF delegates to our Caribbean Financial Action Task Force meeting, when they were introducing the new standards, he put up the picture of somebody who looked like a soldier. And the caption was, well-dressed, but can he fight? The well-dressed is technical compliance. He looked like a soldier, he must be a soldier. But when you put him to the test, can he fight? That's the effectiveness part. So when the standards changed in 2012, 2013, effectiveness then became very important based on what they call 11 immediate outcomes. And that's why you see a lot of movement post that period. And as countries come into for their on-site inspection and the mutual evaluation report, that is what is reflected in the report itself. But let me see if I'm good at this clicker now, because I am not technologically savvy. But the AML-CFT framework, and I'm starting from the national level, the general question that is asked is whether or not money laundering, terrorism financing risks are understood and actions taken to combat money laundering and terrorism financing and proliferation financing, PF. Now, that's at the very national level. Now, understood by whom? It starts with an understanding of the national authorities, because you have a lot of competent authorities involved in AML-CFT. It starts with the members of a steering group that includes like the Attorney General, you have people like Monetary Authority, you have police, you have the FRA, you have lots of different agencies involved in AML-CFT. And no doubt DCI as one of the new supervisors, let's just say. But even below that, you have your understanding. Do you understand AML-CFT? Certainly in your interactions with your customers, and do you have systems in place to be able to detect and deter money laundering, and to also file suspicious activity reports? Or is there the lack of understanding, so the potential money laundering is taking place in actual fact because of that lack of knowledge? So you have different tiers of understanding, even when you talk about the national level. But coming down, you have supervisors. The specific question is, how well does DCI identify and maintain an understanding of the money laundering terrorist financing risk in the DNFBP sector, DPMS sector as a whole, between DPMS and real estate, different types of institutions and different types of individuals within. And then for dealers of precious metals and stones, how well do you understand your money laundering, terrorism financing risks and obligations? Because if you don't, then that in itself is what you call a vulnerability. And risks are broken down into two major areas. The threat is what you call the sort of like the criminal activity or the money laundering itself. Have there been cases? Have there been reports? And have there been suspected cases and so on? The vulnerability is what we do or do not do that leaves that window of opportunity for criminals to come in and wreak havoc. So in simple terms, the way how it was explained to me is that, your neighborhood might be a hotbed of criminal activity, burglaries, let's just say. The burglars are the threat because they do wreak havoc. But what it is that you do or don't do, like for instance, you leave your window open, you don't have a security system. You don't even know that burglars are prowling at night and so on and so on. All those things are vulnerabilities. So when you hear risk, it is broken down into two terms, the threats and the vulnerabilities. There are others like consequences, like, whether or not, what's the likelihood that an activity like that would occur here and so on. But threats and vulnerabilities are the two major areas. Another question, how well do you apply mitigating measures commensurate with the risks? That means that if the risk is very high, then you must, put more measures in place. Like for instance, if you suspect that somebody might be, a money launderer, or somebody is, purchasing from you in very unusual circumstances, it means that you must ask a little bit more question instead of just leaving it per chance and so on, Customer due diligence, do you know the person who is buying? Does his or her transaction, accord with what you think this person is, and are they transparent in terms of their ID and source of income and those type of stuff? I put the anti-money laundering regulations because you quickly have to come to terms with all the laws and regulations, and certainly the money laundering regulations is operationally what you as a DNFBP must be aware of and put things in place in accordance with the anti-money laundering regulations. And Regulation 8 of the anti-money laundering regulations say, a person carrying out relevant financial business shall take steps appropriate to the nature and size of the business to identify, assess, and understand its money laundering and terrorist financing risk in relation to customer, country or geographic area in which the customer under paragraph A resides or operates, products, services, and transactions of the person and the delivery channels. That's very, very high level and so on. It depends on the nature of your business. But if a customer from overseas calls you and want to buy jewelry from you in Bitcoins, I don't know. That's customer, geographic area, product is the jewelry that they want to buy. The delivery channel is, online or however the service is delivered. But you could see all those elements coming in, but it just has fancy words there, or put it at a high level or generic level, yeah? But that's all that means. Bear in mind also that you have to assess the risk, especially of new products and new technologies, right? New delivery mechanisms. So if you decide today that you want to accept, say, virtual assets or cryptocurrency or whatever you call it, have you assessed the risks? And then how are you going to do the customer due diligence and all of those type of things? What kind of systems you have? Because you also could be a victim of fraud, where people start to steal those assets from you the more you have like an online presence and what have you. Take appropriate measures to manage and mitigate risks, because in many cases you cannot reduce risk to absolute zero. Otherwise it means absolute no business. But the higher the risk, the greater you have to take measures to mitigate. That's the key. Our national risk assessment took place in 2015, and it was commissioned by the Cayman Islands government through the Attorney General's chambers, with the collaboration of the Ministry for Financial Services and SEMA. World Bank provided what we call technical assistance. They have a particular template. Typically, when you do a national risk assessment, the country itself, World Bank and IMF are the two international organizations that have had models for assessing the risk of the country. It was coordinated by the Anti-Money Laundering Unit. When I started, I was the only employee, but thank God I added as the national risk assessment got underway. 8 working groups. There were 8 working groups with sectoral vulnerabilities groups that included national threats, national vulnerabilities, banking, securities, insurance, other financial, DNFBPs. And then we had a group called Technical Compliance and Effectiveness, because we had a lot of laws and guidance and those type of things that needed to be updated. If I were to do the national risk assessment today, that DNFBP working group would not have been a DNFBP working group, but a dealers of precious metals and stones working group, a real estate working group. So there would have been a lot of other working groups, or having sub-working groups within a larger working group, because each sector and subsector comes with its different types of risks. Yeah. The review period was between 2012 and 2015. That is for which we had data. At the national level, the threats. Remember, I tell you that the threats are the kind of criminal activities, and I've only listed the kind of higher one because there are a plethora of threats. But certainly, what emerged is that theft, corruption, drug trafficking were the higher ones, for which there were sort of like arrests and investigations and what have you, and even suspicious activity reporting. Foreign threats, a high degree of fraud, and foreign threats mean that the criminal activity would have probably been taking place outside, especially the criminal, or the criminal would have done something outside, but the funds are then channeled through the Cayman Islands, because using a Cayman Islands entity, for instance. So that's the foreign threats were fraud, tax evasion, drug trafficking. And the whole point of the exercise was not only to look at what took place in actuality, but also to, because of our laws and so on, tax offenses, even if they occurred overseas and so on, if they were not criminalized domestically, then the authorities could not take any action against the entity or what have you. So we had to do a lot of changes to our legislation to make sure that under the penal code now, tax fraud and tax offenses are an offense now, and now we can cooperate. Yeah. So I'm saying this because if one of your foreign buyers, for instance, you suspect by whichever means is evading taxes overseas, coming to you to purchase, then there is an obligation, for instance, for you to file a SAR, yeah, a suspicious activity report. And drug trafficking, sometimes a lot of the things happen just where there is adverse report that somebody was arrested overseas for drug trafficking offenses, and then it is found out later that they had funds here in the Cayman Islands. We're all familiar with the HSBC case, where there was a bank that it was a Cayman Islands bank, but its operations were in Mexico, and it was being used, according to the U.S. investigation, for by drug traffickers. So a lot of things take place indirectly and not directly. And all this came out in terms of the national threats, especially the foreign threats. National vulnerabilities, sorry, I'll have to, this one is reversed, so I just put all the bullet points. Less than fulsome implementation of the risk-based approach to AML safety regulation. We needed to do a lot of updates to our laws because our regulations, for instance, hardly mentioned risk. Today, if you look at the anti-money laundering regulation, it mentioned risk certainly over 50 times now, yeah? Shortcomings in domestic cooperation among government agencies at the operational level, notwithstanding strong interagency cooperation at the policy level, because we've always had an anti-money laundering steering group at the policy level, but in terms of agencies clustering together to actually cooperate with each other to do work, that was where we had some difficulty. Lack of supervision of DNFBPs, and I'm talking specifically at that time. Thankfully, we have DCI now. So this is what was occurring, or what occurred, or what we found during the time that we did the NRA. Sanctions and enforcement needed enhancement. Inadequate investigative resources, lack of administrative fines. Administrative fines were not a part of the AML CFT culture, so what enforcement agencies went straight to is criminal enforcement. But supervisors need to be able to be relatively robust, and administrative fines are a possibility. Because, and that is common to a lot of jurisdictions. Where the same kind of things are being found. So it's not only pertinent to the Cayman Islands. Tax crimes were not criminalized at the particular time. So those were major national vulnerabilities. Those are areas for improvement. In terms of the financial sector, these are the scoring. So the higher the score, because you go from 0 or 0.00 to 1. In terms of vulnerability, and 1 would mean it's absolutely vulnerable. 0 means that there's absolutely no vulnerability. The truth lies somewhere in between. Securities, you know, the Cayman Islands is one of the largest collective investment jurisdictions in the world. We all hear about hedge funds. The speed at which transactions take place and so on. So securities, top, followed by banking, and then other financial. Other financial has money services businesses there, so, and that as a category or a subcategory high, and then insurance. In terms of DNFBPs, real estate and dealers of precious metals and stone, we have them somewhere medium, but you know, so accountants are relatively low because most accountants are not doing what we call relevant financial business. Lawyers and trust and corporate services are at the higher end in terms of DNFBPs, even though I would say that SEMA supervisors, trust and corporate services providers, as if though they are financial institutions. Yeah. Generally speaking, for the dealers of precious metals and stones, what the NRA found was that the sector included approximately 36 jewelers. That's at the time. Jewelry manufacturers, jewelry repairers, and second-hand dealers. It was reported at that time that 30% of the client base was from outside the islands, mainly US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. I don't know if that currently reflects reality, but for me, the 30% looks a bit low, but certainly, you know, your input would be important here to make sure that whatever updates we do are correct and so on. The last time we didn't have a supervisor, so we gathered a group of people and it was their opinion that counted at the time. So what we look for is harder and harder evidence, but that is greater. There's a greater possibility of that when there's a supervisor that collects information. So when your supervisor asks you for information, please do not complain. It's contributing to the greater good. One of the largest dealers reported that reported one cash sale greater than $15,000. Again, that was 2014. I don't know how widespread the incidence is of people actually bringing cash higher than 15,000, but that certainly poses an increased risk for which you need to ask questions, and try to establish, well, where did that cash come from? Because if they had used their credit card, then you have that, at least that comfort that that bank would have done the due diligence and so on. But when they bring cash, you don't know, yeah? It was reported that transactions over 10,000 US dollars are rare and mainly done with credit card. At the time, dealers of precious metals and stones had no supervisor. So thank God we've come a long way since that time. I don't know if you're familiar with the mutual evaluation report, but the mutual evaluation report for the Cayman Islands, which was published, I think in March of this year, pointed to a few areas. They had a little table, so I just kind of extracted just in case you hadn't read it, no? And these are generic, but still you need to keep in mind and be aware of. Precious metals and stones can be used as a method to convert illicit cash into legitimate and not necessarily traceable product. Inconsistent conduct of proper due diligence. Again, some people might be very, very vigilant and do proper due diligence and collect ID and get a sense and question the client a little bit more if they're suspicious and so on. Other people are, sure, yeah, give me the money and everything is fine. Wide geographic customer base. And again, that local versus foreign, that 30% ratio still sounds a little bit low to me and so on, but be conscious of the customer base, where they come from and so on. The number of players in the market not fully assessed because they felt that because there is no supervisor, we didn't know how many there were and what categories, because you could be in several businesses, you could be in several types of DNFBP businesses, yeah? And talking about types, you had what I call the retail and especially jewelers as one category. You have precious metal buying and smelting. And the reason why I outline each one of these categories because the types of risks that they face are somewhat different, yeah? Like for instance, if you're buying precious metals to smelt and so on, there is a higher possibility that, domestic crimes, especially the burglaries, would be a focus there, and therefore you have to be vigilant if you are doing that particular segment of business. You have bullion trading. There are some places that you could probably go and buy a bar or this and that here in the Cayman Islands. You have vault and bullion depositories. This, especially the vault and bullion depositories, they deal a lot more with international clients that want to store gold here in the Cayman Islands. Now, that means that there is a possibility of foreign threat, because if you don't know the source of income and so on, then what kind of due diligence are you doing is an important question. You have commodity futures, and that is supervised by SEMA under the Securities and Investment Law. So in terms of DNFBPs, that activity is out of realm or scope for DCI per se. Yeah? Red flags. I just put a few red flags for you to keep in mind, and transactions that appear to be beyond the means of the customer, based on occupation or income. Yep. If you know that the person is a, say domestic helper, and I don't want to pick on any profession per se, but they come to you to buy a $30,000 watch. They might be buying it for the boss and so on, but you need to establish why and under what circumstances, and because even if they're acting on behalf of somebody, then the rules are that you must know that and do due diligence on the person that they're acting on behalf of, because obviously they're not doing a transaction for themselves. Yeah? Unusual payment method, such as large amount of cash, traveler's checks, or cashier's checks, especially as opposed to using your debit card or your credit card. The customer is suspected of using forged, fraudulent, false identity documents or credit card. That you have to be looking out for, because before you know it, your transaction and the person is gone, yeah, and then they're hard to find and hard to trace and things like that. Look out for even false ID, because the person who is up to the normal business, they don't mind giving you an ID, and you will get to know your clients, and you will get to have a sense, even for visitors and so on, as to whether or not they're presenting to you, good ID or something might look suspicious or what have you. Supplier or customer is from a high risk or sanctioned jurisdiction. Certainly, I do understand that that DCI is building its website and will be launching very, very soon, so you know all the countries that are being sanctioned for either money laundering, terrorism financing, proliferation financing, or there's a general political sanction that the international community, especially through the UN, has decided. Yeah, and if you're especially if you're a wholesaler, then you must be conscious of where you're sourcing your materials from, either your goods or your raw materials, because sometimes a lot of these things come from sanctioned countries. I understand there's Kimberley Protocol or something like that, Kimberley process, where you should buy from reputable persons and so on. Yeah. Any questions? This is a quiet bunch, but I believe it's because it's after 5.
We actually have 2 questions.
You have 2 questions.
But not relating to you in particular. So the first question is, tell us more about SARS reports. Our third speaker is going to cover that in detail, so you'll have all the information you need about SARS, hopefully when you leave here. And the other question is, what happens if I didn't register with DCI? That will come in the final presentation when DCI does its presentation to tell you about the administrative fines and what can or cannot happen if you don't comply with the request from DCI. So So those areas will be covered. So keep sending the questions, okay? Don't be shy. We're here to answer the questions as much as possible. So that's it. No questions for Francis?
It seems not.
Clear as glass, right? Thank you, Francis. Thank you. The next speaker we have is the Deputy National Coordinator. Now, if I pronounce her name, I'm going to get into trouble. So I'm going to allow her to tell you her name herself. But we know her, we call her Justine, that's her first name, and she will give you the other part of her name so that I don't get into trouble. And she will come and talk to you about financial sanctions and what happens from the National Coordinator's office. Justine, can you come? Let me mic you up.
Can you hear me? Is that better? Can people at the back hear? No, through the, yeah.
Can you hear? You sure?
Yeah, it's fine.
That's the thing.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight to hear us speak about a topic that's really important to this jurisdiction. And I want to thank particularly DCI for inviting me to present to you this evening. And also, I would like to apologize to everyone because I was supposed to be the first speaker, and unfortunately, I went to the wrong building. And so, hence, there was a little bit of a change in the agenda and a bit of a late start. So, my most sincere apologies, and thank you for bearing with us. So, I'm here to give you a bird's eye view of financial crime and how it relates to the Cayman Islands, how it relates to your profession, and how it relates to the wider world. I know that compliance with AML regulations and laws can be very expensive. It can be very time-consuming for all of you. You all have day jobs, and so this is something else that you have to do on top. So I'm hoping that my presentation will show you that you're part of something, your efforts at AML CFT compliance are part of something bigger than just the DPMS sector, something bigger than the financial services industry, and even something bigger than just the Cayman Islands. So my first slide is that a picture means 1,000 words. And so I just want to use this slide to depict some of the risks that we have here in the Cayman Islands as it relates to financial crime. So sometimes we hear from regulated entities, I know I've been a regulator for over 12 years and I've heard it so many times, that there are no risks in the Cayman Islands. We're a small jurisdiction, we don't have any risk. But actually, all of these pictures are taken from the media in the Cayman Islands, and they all relate to offenses that have occurred here. And offenses that also, some of these offenses have also occurred in the DPMS sector. So, for example, you might remember that an individual was trying to buy some jewelry in a store using 5 different credit cards. Or individuals came from foreign countries, tried to skim bank accounts. And that might have been, that money from those bank accounts might have been used to purchase precious metals and stones. Okay. So we are not immune. We as a jurisdiction and you as professionals are not immune to the threat from money laundering and terrorism financing. So far this year, there's been approximately $1.2 trillion that have been laundered. And usually annually, the money that's laundered annually is about 3 to 5% of the world's GDP. Of course, this is not a very precise statistic because a lot of money launderers and terrorism financiers don't get caught. And so this is just a rough estimate. Money laundering has very negative social and economic consequences for a country. So when there is money laundering in a country, the country's financial institutions lose their legitimacy and they lose their place. the country loses out on a reputational front. And the ease with which the ease of money laundering in a country is also contributes to increased criminality, because criminals perceive the jurisdiction as being a jurisdiction where it's easy to launder dirty money. But of course, we're not just talking about money laundering, right? So my presentation is actually on financial crime generally, and there are three main types of offenses that we're concerned about. So money laundering I've just talked about. The second one that you'll hear is proliferation financing. Proliferation financing, if you can pronounce it correctly, is the financing of weapons of mass destruction. So building bombs. Now you might think, well, it's kind of a far-fetched idea that somebody come here at the Cayman Islands and build a bomb, but actually what happens is that people who are associated with regimes, for example, Iran and North Korea, that do build weapons of mass destruction, buy pieces all over the world, pieces or resources, to be able to build these weapons of mass destruction. And those resources come from many different parts of the world and then are assembled together in the target jurisdiction. So it's not as far-fetched as one might think, even for us in the Cayman Islands. So the price to build a nuclear weapon in North Korea, this is a North Korea statistic, somewhere between 18 to 53, I think that should say million, 18 to 53 million dollars. As you know, there's sanctions upon North Korea, so they don't actually do a lot of trade with the outside world. So where does this money come from? Where do they get the money to build their weapons? Right? Would they get it from people who finance, who illegitimately finance those regimes? Similarly, the third financial crime that's really important to know about is terrorism financing. So as the name suggests, terrorism financing is the financing of either terrorist organizations or terrorist activities. So you see a stat that's very, very sad. Over 8,500 terrorist attacks in 2017 all over the world, with just under 20,000 casualties. It takes very, very little money to stage a successful terrorist attack. I'll give you an example. If you remember, some of you might remember, a few years ago in Paris, there was a terrorist that went and blew himself up in a newspaper called Charlie Hebdo. That attack cost $6,000. And it was basically obtained by selling, getting into a fake auto accident and getting a small loan from a payday lender. It really doesn't take much, and that took the lives of several people. And again, you can see, even though that there is a prohibition, obviously, on terrorism financing and the financing of terrorist activities, these organizations are actually quite rich. So for those of you who can't see, Hezbollah has an annual revenue of $1.1 billion. Taliban makes about $800 million a year. Hamas, 700 million, Al-Qaeda, 300 million, obviously they're a little bit on the decline, and ISIS in 2015 was pulling in $80 million a month. For ISIS, it's about 5% of those were actually from people who gave money to ISIS. They also had oil revenues and extortions and so on, but about 5% of that $80 million actually came from individuals. So I'm just going back to the basics a little bit. Bear with me if you know this already. It's really, really important to understand what money laundering is and what all these financial crimes are, because that gives you a foundation upon which to build. So money laundering is basically the process of making large amounts of money that are generated by criminal offenses, making them look like making the money look like it came from a legitimate source. So the money, we say the money is dirty because the money came from a criminal activity, and then money launderers launder it to make it look clean. So there's 3 stages of money laundering, and you can see in the picture. The first stage is after, for example, the drug dealer gets the drug money, they want to place it into the financial system. So at the time of placing it into the financial system, there has to be a gatekeeper. So if they try to place it in a bank, for example, the bank would have to be the gatekeeper to not allow these funds into the financial system. Layering, they might combine money with money from legitimate sources. And then they try to integrate it into the society, for example, by purchasing luxury assets such as DPMS. So, precious metals and stones. And so in your role as a DPMS, you might be involved at the placement stage because someone might come to you, for example, with a forged credit card, come to you want to pay in cash with drug money, but maybe not. You might also be, for example, involved in the integration stage where the money already appears legitimate, but it's actually not. And it's used basically to, the money launderer purchases these these precious assets in order to hide the origin of the money. So other financial crimes, as I mentioned, terrorist financing is providing financial support to terrorist activities. And then proliferation financing, which is providing funds, financial services, or any other type of support that is used to produce weapons of mass destruction. Currently, proliferation financing is really focused on 2 countries, which are Iran and North Korea. The other thing that's really important to know is what we call targeted financial sanctions. And I'm not sure how many of you here were at the presentation we gave on July 24th. Okay, so a couple. Okay, so the United Nations and the European Union sometimes, as a policy measure, implement sanctions on either people, individuals, ships, entities, or countries in order to change the behavior of the person, to impose punitive measures on the person, or to suppress terrorist activity. There are lists of these people, entities, so on, that are published, and it is expected that every person must be on the lookout not to make resources available to those people. So the sanctions can take several forms. So for example, you can have a travel ban. So the UN can decide that so-and-so from this country may not travel. But the one we're most concerned about is obviously freezing assets. So there is an asset freeze that can be imposed. And if there is an asset freeze, that means that the person cannot move anything of value. What this means to you is that if you come into contact with a designated person in the course of your trade, you have to try to immobilize as much as you can the money. We get sanctions passed down to us. We're not a member of the UN, obviously, so the sanctions are passed down to us from the UK, extended to overseas territories. So we follow, at the moment, the lists that are used in the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has a huge office called the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, and they are responsible for maintaining the list of individuals, amending the list and putting new countries and so on and so forth. So because we have these sanctions orders that are extended to us by the UK, we as a community and everyone on this island, but particularly people who are doing relevant financial business, must ensure that they have processes and procedures to screen their customers against these sanctions list. On the website, on the OFSI website, there is actually one consolidated list that you can download. It's really, really long, but it's free. It's free and it changes. And so you can go on the website, check your customer against the sanctions list. If you see someone, if you get a match on a name, and you'll see, I'll show you a little bit. Actually, I can flip it here. So you'll see that this is what it looks like. This is just the first little bit of it, but this is how the list starts. So the list will give you the names of individuals, their date of birth, if they have it, the address, aliases, and so on and so forth. If you have a hit, if you do a search on your customer and you get a hit against one of these people, you must make a report to the Financial Reporting Authority. You must also immediately freeze the funds and not make any funds or economic resources available to that person. Now, this could also apply, just backing up bear with me, just one little thing that I want to point out is that when you talk about money laundering, you are concerned about where the money comes from, right? So the money comes from criminal activity. Not, when you're talking about terrorism financing, you could have money that is legitimately earned, but you're concerned about the destination of the funds. So in targeted financial sanctions, it can be money you receive or money that, or goods that you will ship out. So these targeted financial sanctions I mentioned applicable to everyone on this island. It's very, very important. It's also part of the new, if you're familiar with the anti-money laundering regulations, there is a new requirement in those regulations to have process and procedures to screen customers' financial sanctions. I hear that you'll hear a little bit later on from the Financial Reporting Authority, but from what I heard, you will soon be able to subscribe on their website to get updates on the sanctions list, because the sanctions lists do change quite frequently. All right, so I'm going to just go through a few cases. Most of them are kind of retail money laundering cases that involve dealers of precious metals and stones. So there's the one case that involved a very organized drug dealing operation where the street level drug dealers would, instead of getting money for the drugs they sold, they would get jewelry. And the jewelry would get passed on up the chain, and the people at the top of the pyramid would go and sell the jewelry to secondhand stores and jewelry stores. So some of the red flag indicators is that the sale of the jewelry, they sold the jewelry at very small incremental amounts. They made frequent deposits of checks, and then they had links to organized crime. Another, this case relates to storage of precious metals. And so there was a Brazilian national who was transferring money into an investment account into a bank, and then was, little by little, he didn't invest anything. He said he wanted to invest, but actually did no investments. But little by little, he was transferring money out of the account without having invested it. And he was transferring it to the United States. And I should say, this happened in Austria, right? So you have 3 countries that are involved, which is kind of suspicious to start with. But the bank got really suspicious, and they made a report to the prosecutor's office, and another bank had also raised the same kind of suspicion because they saw this person going into their vault, their safety deposit box, over and over and over again. So the police got a search warrant, and they were able to open the vault, the safety deposit box, and they found fake passports and large amounts of diamonds. So it turns out that this individual was basically using these small denominations that he was taking from his Austrian bank account, purchasing diamonds, and then storing them into the vault. And then this is the third one. This actually involves the dealer being complicit in the money laundering scheme. So basically, this man who operated the jewelry store, he knew that the jewelry he was buying was stolen, was bought with stolen money over the internet by people who stole credit card information. And the thieves had searched trash containers to find people's credit card numbers, and then they purchased diamonds through a prepaid mobile phone. What this retailer did with the diamonds, he went to resell the diamonds to another retailer. So it kind of shows you that it's not just who you sell to, but also who you buy from that sometimes can be suspicious. One of the red flag indicators here was that the diamonds were sold for half of their value. So switching gears a little bit, I've told you a little bit about the worldwide impact and landscape when it comes to financial crime. And I want to bring it back to us now. So you have heard Francis talk about the Financial Action Task Force, which is a Paris-based organization, and they issue standards that countries must follow in relation to money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing. They have what's known as 40 recommendations that must be implemented in a country, and immediate outcomes, 11 immediate outcomes. Countries, every country in the world, most countries in the world, get assessed against these standards periodically. So Cayman Islands was assessed once in 2007. We did very well. Unfortunately for us, the standards changed in 2012, and we did not so well. So this report was published in March of this year, and now the country is working at remediating the recommendations that were made to our country in that report. Because we did very poorly, we are now stuck in this process called an enhanced follow-up process, which means that within a year's time, we have a year's time from last February, so about half a year left now, to demonstrate that we are making tangible and sufficient progress towards rectifying our AML CFT deficiencies. If we don't do that by that time frame, which is March 2020, we will be put on what's called a gray list. A gray list is not good for the country. It has severe implications for our banking system, particularly correspondent banking, and other financial services relationships, which obviously can have a downhill effect on everyone. If we are put on this gray list, the FATF will impose upon us the actions that they want us to take, that they feel that we need to take to remedy our shortcomings. We lose control at that point of our own process. So obviously the fact that you are all here tonight, that you are all registering with DCI, that you will implement your controls and screen your customers, that is all part of this big effort so that we don't end up on this gray list next year. You are not the only ones who are working really hard at the remediation. And you see here you see a chart of all of the supervisory bodies and the law enforcement bodies that are involved in this effort. So you have, of course, your supervisor, DCI, who's responsible for regulating dealers in precious metals and stones as well as real estate agents. You have SILPA, and that's the body who's in charge of regulating lawyers. You have SIPA, who's responsible for regulating accountants. You have CIMA, which does financial institutions, and the Registrar of Companies that's responsible for nonprofit organizations. And then at the bottom, you see how many law enforcement entities are involved in this process. So the Premier, a little while ago, during a statement made to the LA, he indicated that remediation of the Cfatf recommendations is a national priority. And I think it's evident when we see how much infrastructure has been put in place to make that happen. This is, so here I was showing the agencies, and this is the central government part of things. So you have the cabinet. Under the cabinet, you'll see that a ministerial subcommittee was created just for this purpose. Reporting to this subcommittee is the National Coordination Team, of which I am part of. You have the Anti-Money Laundering Steering Group, another Interagency Coordination Committee, and a Financial Crimes Focus Group. And of course, you have the Anti-Money Laundering Unit. So there is, behind the scenes, there's a huge government machinery to try to save us from the gray list. So as I mentioned, we have a national coordination team, which I'm part of. It's an 18-month process, so hopefully at the end of it, we will not be on the gray list and the national coordination team will be disbanded. We help, as national coordinators, we help all of the agencies to make sure that they are making progress in the recommended actions that are related to their work. So for example, I assist DCI when they have questions, when they want to run things by me. I advise on technical matters, and whatever an agency needs to be able to make progress. Because of course, the people in the agencies themselves have full-time jobs, and AML might not be their full-time responsibility. So this is pretty much what I had to say, but I also want to, I'm hoping that I can circulate the slides to the participants. And I just want to leave you with a couple of resources that you can read through at your own time. So of course, a very important body to know is the Financial Reporting Authority. Because if you do see suspicions, if you have suspicions, if you hit a designated person who comes to buy jewelry from you, this is who you will be in touch with. The FATF, which I mentioned before, which is this international organization that sets the standards that we must all comply with, has published 2 sets of guidance that are helpful to dealers in precious metals and stones. Unfortunately, their titles are not very helpful, but when you read through the guidance, hopefully you can find something to assist you in interpreting what you have to do. There's also case studies, there's red flags. So these are really, really good documents to read through. They're free, they're on the internet. And then the other piece of the puzzle, as I mentioned before, the Office of Sanctions Implementation in the UK, which is where you'll find your consolidated list of designated persons. So that's it.
Thank you, Justine. Any questions for Justine?
Yeah.
The sanctions list,
Mm-hmm.
so you're saying like if you have a customer comes in and you suspect and you search on that list, if you find the name,
Mm-hmm.
you have to report it
To the Financial Reporting
But
Authority.
Is that person then, because he's on a sanction list, is he like a criminal? Or-
Usually the people who are on the sanctions list are people who are going to be, for example, terrorists,
Right,
part of a terrorist organization.
okay.
They can be corrupt politicians, so in corrupt regimes, because sanctions are really used to exert pressure. So you can have, for example, if you have sanctions against North Korea, it can be part of that big North Korean cadre of government, right? So these are kind of the people that these international sanctions are targeting.
My question is really, if the person standing in front of you in your store,
Yeah.
wouldn't they have been, is there a connection between that and immigration, that list? And
Yes.
So they would be hard for them to get in
Well,
the island, right?
in an ideal world,
Yeah.
it would be hard for them to get onto the island. The stage we are right now, it's not impossible for them to get onto the island. Due to 2 things. One is that, as you might know from the recent press, there is no screening of passengers who come on private planes. There were 6,000 private planes that landed in the Cayman Islands last year. The other thing is obviously the boats, right? You never know. I mean, they do our best to catch the boats, to intercept boats, but you don't know who's here. So in an ideal world, immigration will have an automatic check for designated persons, but I don't know if that's fully functional at this particular time. Yeah.
So what's the expectation then for retail customers coming in and purchasing? Is there an expectation to screen everyone that comes in to buy a piece of jewelry?
I think I can let Claudia speak to that a little bit later on, because that's you'll hear from her presentation about your obligations and how they can be put into practice. But let's say
And just to say quickly, that is really not logical in the real world.
It'll be tough.
Yes. What our expectation mainly is that if you have a suspicion or unease about something, and many of you have been involved in business for a long time, you know when something does not feel right or sound right or look right. And once you have taken the appropriate action to show that you have done all that you could possibly do, as your regulator, then we take that into consideration. But like Francis said earlier, you can never ensure that there's no risk at all, because there is always going to be some risk in business. Okay?
I wanted to mention also that there's usually a threshold, and I think really important is 10,000 or yeah, like if somebody wants to buy and if it's higher than a particular amount.
The most is
10,000.
15.
Yeah, 15. Okay.
15,000.
Yeah, so
Under the AMLRs for the occasional transactions is $15,000.
it's 15,000. So typically, if it's below the threshold and so on, and everything looks normal, typically you don't. You may want to take precautions for your own sake in case you suspect that it might be fraudulent. In fact, it's a good practice. If it's over that, no doubt you must do the due diligence because that's what the law requires. So it makes some sort of distinction. If you suspect, even if it's $1, then you ask questions. Can I see your ID? Can I, let's, because you have to identify and verify to the best that you can.
Then you're gonna lose the sale.
No, not at all, because most people who are, if I go to the grocery store asks me for my ID.
Yeah, but
So,
a lot of people get offended when you ask for
So,
it. You know, you have to ask carefully for it.
I do understand that, but what I'm saying is that if, certainly for me as a local, if my grocery store asks me for my ID, if I'm paying $30, why would I get upset if, I go and buy a jewelry store and I buy like a $500 watch or whatever, and you ask for my ID.
It's a cultural thing, and visitors, you just have to be careful with them. They will again give it to you, but it's how you ask.
And I think it's a bit of a copy of the ID, it's different. It's one thing to see the ID.
Yes.
It's another thing to say, okay, can I make a copy of
Yes.
the ID? So
That's why I
it's
said the threshold is an important thing, because if it is normal transaction, normal business, you have no reason to suspect and things like that. But the higher you go, you just have to ensure that you implemented something a little bit more, and especially if it appears that this is way beyond what that person made. And I say may because, again, somebody walking in could look raggedy but be very, very rich. Okay, so all that has to be. But something is amiss, and therefore you got to dig a little bit deeper.
And the other thing to consider as well is their way of making payment. You have persons that will come into the jewelry store and use multiple credit cards. And as a clerk, you would end up having to swipe several cards and cards being rejected, and try this one, and try this one. And I've seen situations where clerks have actually run 10 credit cards to try to do one sale. Now, at what point do you become uncomfortable with that type of activity? Because if someone is coming in to buy a Rolex, you would hope that at least the first credit card would work, not going between 10 credit cards, or 10 credit cards are going to be declined before you get to the right credit card. So those sorts of things should make you feel uneasy, yeah? And when it starts to make you feel uneasy is when you should start to think, or a light bulb should go off, something may not be right. Okay?
What happens when they give you the credit card, you've done it 10 times, but they still provide you with the ID, and they give you all the required documents that you ask them for? You go ahead with the transaction and then file a star, or so
You're saying if they use 10 credit cards to make
you
the sale, but give you your ID?
If they give you a proper ID and everything, and
At the end of the day, it's a business decision if you're gonna decide to take those 10 credit cards. But once we come in as the regulator and start to do an audit, we're gonna ask you the question, why did you take 10 credit suspicious, what did you do from there? Those are the questions we're going to ask you.
Transaction and then file it.
It depends on how you feel and what has happened, and then Mr. Berry is going to talk about SARS in a little bit. But it's a business decision if you're going to do that sale, but be prepared that when regulator comes in to do your audit, that you are able to explain why you did what you did and what mitigating factors you had in place to ensure that you did things properly.
This 30% audit, something that's come up.
Well, when we come in to do your inspection, it's sort of like an audit of your process. What do you do internally? Not your financials. We're not into that.
We can't do financial audit because I wouldn't know where to start.
Just for clarification, though, under the proceeds of crime law, if you do cash transactions,
Mm-hmm.
here in the discussion, obviously, there's this on all levels regarding method of payment.
But it talks about cash transactions, 15,000 and over. But there are other transactions that can make you
Oh,
uncomfortable.
absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah?
yes, yeah.
So the cash first, if it's over, the credit cards, if there are multiple credit cards, etc.
Well, it can be cash and multiple.
Cash and multiple cards, and they can split it up different ways that they're paying for it. And I think Francis spoke earlier about travelers' checks, and then they use a credit card, and then they use something else. The last outreach we had, I was given an example of someone who went into several jewelry stores to buy jewelry, used a credit card in the name of a female, and presented his male credit card, and the sale still happened. And after there was panic among these 3 or 4 jewelry stores, and back in those days, in my other life, I was part of RCIPS. And when we recovered everything, we finally found out that this man had about 5 credit cards he was going around using. He had about 4 passports. And when we searched his hotel room, he had about something like 25 credit cards hidden in the vent. So he was going to different places, but because there was no sort of control to start with and no one asked the question, thankfully the lady took a picture or took a photocopy of his ID, and we could trace the person, but he used several credit cards, and one in particular where the sale went through was in the name of a female. Now, why would you continue with that sale? Because he had no female with him.
One of the things that we do in our control is to ensure that they're looking for the pattern as well, not just the amount. Because the pattern of a 2,000 there, a 3,000 there, 4,000 there, always flying under the radar.
Yes.
You know, is,
It doesn't meet the threshold.
yes, so, when, you know, when a red flag,
It's almost like money services business. You can go and send 1,000, and you have people who will go to 4 different money services and send under the threshold, so they're not flagged. You know, so it happens. It's just for you to be vigilant. So hopefully, any questions you have as it relates to SARS will be covered in this part of the presentation. And after you leave here, you'll be well educated about SARS and what you need to do. All right, so I'll hand over to Mr. Berry.
Thank you, Claudia. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is RJ Berry. I'm the director of the FRA, and I'm going to give you a walkthrough of SAR filing obligations, what the role of the FRA is, what we do, and hopefully leave you with some information on things that should heighten your sensitivities to risks that you would face and situations where that could lead to suspicious activity reporting. Most of my presentation's factual, but I suspect you're going to have a lot of questions for me and ask me to offer opinions. Where I offer an opinion, it is my personal opinion and not necessarily those of the Cayman Islands government or the FRA. So this evening, here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you an overview of the FRA, what we do. I'll give you some statistics to show you the types of reports we're receiving, what we're doing with them. I'm going to speak briefly on the role of DNFBPs in combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, and then walk you through how you file a SAR and situations that might give rise to that. So the FRA is the Financial Intelligence Unit for the Cayman Islands. We're established under Section 3 of the Proceeds of Crime Law. We're an administrative FIU, and what that means is that the FRA is responsible for receiving, analyzing, and disseminating disclosures of information regarding proceeds of criminal conduct or suspected proceeds of criminal conduct. What that, in a nutshell, means is that the investigating takes place separately. The Royal Cayman Islands Police Force, the Financial Crime Investigation Unit's responsible for formally investigating criminal conduct. The FRA is an administrative FIU where we gather intelligence, we receive disclosures, and disseminate them accordingly, including to law enforcement. In Justine's presentation, I think Justine pronounces her last name Plenkowitz. There you go, because you didn't actually say it, Justine, so I'll say it for you. And I didn't get in trouble for saying it. Justine's already touched on the fact that the FRA has a role with regard to targeted financial sanctions. So in 2017, and I don't think it would surprise you that it was leading up to the mutual evaluation on-site, this role was delegated to the Financial Reporting Authority for ensuring the implementation of targeted financial sanctions with respect to terrorism, terrorism financing, proliferation financing, and any other restrictive measures. Now, last month, I did a fairly in-depth presentation on targeted financial sanctions and don't intend to do that this afternoon because I was asked to focus on filing SARS. That presentation is available. DCI has it, so I would encourage you to get a copy of it because it does walk you through the regimes. Justine already touched on the overseas orders in council that are extended through the UK, but we do have domestic legislation under the terrorism law and the proliferation, finance, and prohibition law. And both those pieces of legislation automatically recognize designated persons under UN Security Council resolutions and the UK, right? So in addition to the overseas orders in council, there's this domestic legislation. I also just want to clarify briefly here because the reporting obligation on the targeted financial sanctions is completely separate than filing a suspicious activity report. I think you asked the question, sir, about whether they're a criminal. For all intents and purposes, if a designated person is just that, they've been designated by a competent authority in the set, well, let me not say competent authority, they've been designated by the UN, the EU, or the UK. You're not suspicious about them. They are designated. There are sanctions in place against them. They could range depending on the regime. The big four, as we call it, on the terrorism is ISIL and Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, and the two on the proliferation, as Justine mentioned, are North Korea and Iran. Those sanctions regimes are, they can, for our purposes, we focus on targeted financial sanctions, and what that really is not providing financial assets or economic resources or any services to a designated person. So it actually is more than doing a transaction with them. If you hold gold for them or you hold something or you custodize something for them, if they're a designated person, you're prohibited from making those funds or economic resources available to them. It's a separate reporting regime. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's detailed in the presentation. There is guidance on the FRA's website, and I think the reporting form for targeted financial sanctions, I think, is in Annex 2 of the guidance. So that's a bit about the FRA. The role of the private sector, I mean, really the private sector plays a crucial role in preventing the abuse of the financial system for the purposes of money laundering, terrorist financing, or proliferation financing. So the private sector, including DNFBPs, a lot of times these presentations are driven at financial institutions because that's typically where the money flows are, but obviously dealing in precious metals and stones, you can be dealing with high value goods. And so you are the gatekeepers to the system. One of the things I like to stress is that in the FATF recommendations, Justine mentioned 40% of them are actually targeted towards the private sector in either preventative measures or targeted financial sanctions. So it's not solely on, obviously the competent authorities and supervisors are there to supervise and ensure that you're doing what you need to do, but it's important that you understand your role as well. This is a list of the domestic legislation that's in place to combat money laundering, terrorists, and terrorist financing and proliferation financing. Again, for the purposes of this evening, we're focusing on the proceeds of crime law and the anti-money laundering regulations. The SAR filing responsibilities fall under POCL, and the anti-money laundering regulations are issued pursuant to POCL, and those really set out the requirements for anyone doing relevant financial business that they have to satisfy. And I think Claudia will be speaking more to what's required. These are just is an excerpt from our annual report. You can see that suspicious activity reporting is significantly trending up. If you look back to 2016-17, that was back when the government was on a fiscal year of 1st July to 30th of June, 601 SARs. In the 6-month period, 1st July to 31st December, there were 563. Including that number, though, and you'll see on the next slide, there was a significant one-off event that happened in July 2017, which would affect those numbers. But the 2018 numbers, 935, show a clear increase in suspicious activity reporting. There's the anomaly I was talking about. So that's sort of a monthly trending for you over the years, and you can see in 2017. There was a big spike, 200 and I think 20 odd SARs that month. Yeah, we were busy. Top 5 sources of reports. I don't think it would surprise anybody that banks lead the way with 41%. These are excerpts from the 2018 report. FIUs are overseas financial intelligence units. They're our counterparts. They either make requests for information to us, but also make spontaneous disclosures to us. So if they have information that they believe would be useful to the FRA or the law enforcement in the Cayman Islands, they have the ability to spontaneously disclose that to us. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, SAR filings from DNFBPs, in particular dealers in precious metals and stones, would be caught in the other. Based on some checks I did, I think 7 SARs were filed by entities in the DPMS sector in 2018, and I think year to date in 2019 we received 9. Again, a summary of the top reasons for filing SARs. Suspicious activity leads the way, and I'll speak more to that on the next slide. Fraud, Francis, I think in his presentation identified that one of the top threats, particularly from a foreign perspective, is fraud. Corruption. Money laundering is a broad category. What you find nowadays is that money laundering charges are being brought because there's so many underlying predicates that it's just easier to describe it as a money laundering case, because it usually involves an element of fraud, bribery, corruption, so forth. And tax evasion rounded out the top 5. So for suspicious activity, one of the things we did a couple years back is it's a little circular to say, well, the top reason for filing a suspicious activity is suspicious activity. So what we tried to do was then break those down, and we try to stay away from that category, but in cases where there isn't a clear predicate, what we've done is we've started to break out suspicious activity into 6 categories. Transactions that are inconsistent with the client profile leads the way. Inadequate or inconsistent information. This sometimes happens when people are doing updated KYC and they start to get inconsistent information when they're collecting new KYC, and they look at what was on file previously, and they start to see inconsistencies, or they can't get the KYC. Unusual conditions or circumstances, this is always a tricky one to explain. The best example I can give is we once had a case where a large amount of cash was involved and it just smelt bad. We've had cases where it smells like drugs or marijuana, or cases where the cash actually, you can tell someone's either been keeping it somewhere or storing it in an area where it probably ought not to be. High volume transactions. Again, this sometimes overlaps with an inconsistent client profile, but high volumes usually large amounts that really aren't expected. We've talked a little about structuring, people with a transaction pattern that it's either clear they're trying to avoid a reporting threshold, or they don't want it all in their name, so they ask a friend to send money on behalf of them, so forth. And lastly, lacking economic purpose. Some transactions just actually don't make any sense, and when they get executed, there really is no rhyme or reason for the transaction. In our annual report, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. This is really just a snapshot of what took place last year. We made 283 domestic disclosures, 178 to the Financial Crime Unit, 73 to SEMA, 16 to Immigration. In the financial sanctions implementation side, we posted 102 financial sanctions notices on our website. What we're trying to do now is, as soon as we get an alert that a sanctions regime has been updated, we're preparing what we call a Caymanized sanctions notice, posting it on our website, distributing it to the competent authorities and supervisors. Justine is about 90% correct. We are rolling out an automated notification to entities where we don't have a e-alert sign up on our website. We don't have that functionality yet, but we will be asking people to sign up, and once we have your email, we will be sending them to you directly. Snapshot of 935 SARs received, initial analysis conducted on 719 cases. That is not 719 of those 935, that's 719. We do have cases from previous years that we're still working on, and we completed 602 analysis last year. And by that we mean we closed the case, either no further action or we did the disclosure. In terms of a global contribution, we received 95 requests for information from overseas FIUs. We made 55 inquiries to overseas FIUs, and we made 206 disclosures to overseas FIUs. That 206 would include responses to requests and spontaneous disclosures. Our top 3 recipients overseas are FinCEN in the US, the NCA in the UK, and COAF in Brazil. So I think this is the meat and matter of what we want to discuss this evening. POCL imposes an obligation on any person to file a suspicious activity report. And the way it does it is that it creates an offense if you don't do it. So a person commits an offense under Section 136 of POCL if he knows, and let's be gender correct, he or she knows or suspects or has reasonable grounds for knowing or suspecting that another person is engaged in criminal conduct. That information or other matter on which his knowledge or suspicion is based, or which gives reasonable grounds for such knowledge or suspicion, came to him in the course of a business in the regulated sector or other trade, profession, business, or employment. So if that information comes to you while you're performing your services as a dealer of precious metals and stones, you commit an offense if you have suspicion or know or suspect that someone's engaged in criminal conduct that wants to do a transaction with you. We're going to walk through the form in a minute, but in the disclosure, you need to identify those who may be involved in money laundering, any other information that's prescribed in the form. If you have knowledge or have information about where the property with respect to the criminal conduct is held. So if you're filing a suspicious activity report on suspicions of criminal conduct, you should be familiar with the definition of criminal conduct under the Proceeds of Crime Law in the relevant section. So Section 144 of POCL is the relevant section, and basically in Cayman we have what we call an all crimes regime. Criminal conduct is conduct which constitutes an offense in any part of the islands, or it would constitute an offense in any part of the islands if it occurred here. So Francis gave an example of tax earlier. I think in 2017, I think it's Section 317 or somewhere thereabouts. The penal code was amended, and it's commonly what we refer to as the tax provision. The section doesn't use the word tax once, but what it does is it says it's an offense to cheat the government of any revenue due to it. which in a sense means if you owe tax to a government and you don't pay it, you've committed an offense, and the Cayman regime now recognizes that. So even though we don't have personal income tax in the Cayman Islands, that provision is broad enough to cover any cheating of any government of any revenue due to it. You really can't talk about SAR filings without talking about tipping off. So tipping off is an offense, and a lot of people worry about tipping off, and they say, oh, well, I can't say anything to my boss, or I can't say anything to my supervisor because it might be tipping off. The tipping off provisions are very clear. They're in the slide, but I'm going to read them to you. A person commits an offense if he knows or suspects that an activity in relation to which a disclosure is required to be made under POCL, whether it's about to take place, is taking place, or has taken place, and whether or not the disclosure has been or is likely to be made in relation thereto, if you make a disclosure that's likely to prejudice any investigation that might arise as a result of a SAR filing, you've committed tipping off. So to me, in layman's terms, if you tell your client that you're going to file a SAR on them because their activity is suspicious, you are guilty of tipping off. Not as applicable for this group, because the tipping off provision was recently amended, because in the financial industry, what you have happening is you have major financial groups operating, and so the question always arises, well, can my Cayman office tell my office in jurisdiction X that we filed a SAR? We have the same client. The client in jurisdiction X is the same as the client in Cayman. Surely the office in jurisdiction X should know about it. So we've actually recently amended the Section 139, and it basically has a few carve-outs of what is not an offense. So it includes sharing within a financial group's worldwide programs, and other criteria there. So the disclosure, if you make a disclosure in carrying out a function that you have relating to the enforcement of any provision of this law or any other enactment relating to criminal conduct or benefit from a criminal conduct, that's excluded as well. I'm sure we'll probably have some questions on tipping off. So let's talk about internal reporting and red flags. Again, the FRA primarily interacts with the money laundering reporting officers of firms or companies. Let me use companies. Most companies or firms then have an internal reporting mechanism to that person, and then the MLRO is then responsible for making a determination as to whether a SAR should be filed with the FRA. I always like to explain to people that there's unusual transactions and suspicious transactions. I think it's imperative that people are sensitized to unusual transactions, because to me, unusual transactions are just that. They should prompt you to ask further questions or really think a little hard about what's happening. And by asking certain questions or doing a review or doing some research, you might be able to mitigate it and say, okay, well, actually that explains this. So even though it's unusual, I'm quite comfortable that we're okay here. Suspicious to me is really you have unusual transactions that you really cannot satisfy yourself that they're not unusual and that they give rise to suspicion of criminal conduct. Please remember that a SAR is just that. You're filing a suspicious activity report of either knowing or suspecting that someone's engaged in criminal conduct. Okay? POCL doesn't give you a definition of suspicious activity report. It could be a pattern of transactions. It could be one transaction. And again, stressing Section 136, you know or suspect, and there's a reasonableness test. You know or suspect, or you have reasonable grounds to know or suspect. I'm sure Claudia will cover it a bit, but that's the test that the regulator or the supervisor will apply when they do on-sites or have questions for you. And it's when I was an MLRO, I always used to say to myself, if somebody else came and looked at this, what opinion or what conclusion would they likely come to? What would a reasonable person really assess here, and what conclusion would they come to? Before filing a SAR, and again, doing outreach to DNFBPs, particular dealers of precious metals or stones, and realtors. It's a very different landscape to me than a bank. So it's quite easy for a private banker to ask their customer additional questions. It might be a little bit more difficult for you guys, with a customer in front of you, and it might be the only time that you ever deal with this customer. But I would endorse what Francis was saying there, and Claudia. There are certain scenarios that arise that, in and of themselves, just aren't normal. And I think those are the ones where you've got to ask yourself about, well, what do I do? Make further inquiries. I get the whole thing about asking for ID or different things and how that needs to be done. There may be cases where after the fact you then go and say, well, let's do some more work on this and do additional background checks. If it is a regular client, then you may want to flag that account for, I don't know, maybe we should have a discussion about exactly how you would set up a client database. Again, in the banking world, it's far easier where you essentially say, well, when RJ comes in to do his next transaction, we're going to ask him for his passport copy, or we have him on enhanced monitoring. But these are things that you should be doing, and again, avoiding tipping off. How to report, we're going to walk through the form, but there is a prescribed form under the Proceeds of Crime Disclosure Order 2010. We require the completed form to be submitted to us, and the reality is that the form has all these fields for you to fill out because all the information is important to us, and it's important that you provide a comprehensive report to us. So let's take a look at the form. The form is available on our website, but essentially I'm going to walk you through quickly. The first page is really details on who's reporting the SARS. So it's the name of the reporting entity, your address, the name of your money laundering reporting officer, how we can get in touch with that person, the type of reporting entity you are, and the nature of services provided. Now, you may ask, why is that all important? Well, I showed you some stats earlier, and in order for us to produce statistics of who we're receiving SARS from, what the suspicion is in terms of predicate offense, the services provided, it's important that we capture that. Section 2 is really about the subject of the report. If you're dealing with a natural person, as much information as possible. Complete name, if you have their nationality, obviously gender. If you know what they do for a living, please include that. Any addresses you have for them, contact details, whether it be telephone, fax, email, identification details. If you've got a copy of the ID, you typically have a date of issue and place of issue. Again, an account number, that's slanted towards obviously a financial institution, and any other parties that have authority to transact on behalf of this person. The same information is sought on what we call legal entities or arrangements. So if it's a company or a partnership or a trust or a charity, you're asked to identify the type of entity, the name of the entity. If you know what the jurisdiction of incorporation or establishment, to include that. Knowing who their registered office or agent is. Shareholders, directors, ultimate beneficial owners. Again, more geared towards financial institutions who have corporate clients. But I think when later on in my presentation, particularly when we're talking about counterparties that you might be dealing with, some of this information will be relevant. If you are aware of other financial service providers involved in the activity, so for example, if you're a dealer in precious metals or stones and you're paying a counterparty, and for whatever reason you've become suspicious of the counterparty that you're doing business with, and you're filing a SAR on them, if you know where you were going to pay them, that's the kind of information that would be included here. You would know that they bank at ABC Limited and whatever jurisdiction have their account number. And then to me, the most important section is this section 5, the reason for suspicion. there are a lot of studies out there that essentially show that in most jurisdictions, the quality of SARs filed are fairly poor. And one of the objectives of the FRA is to essentially try to improve quality of SARs by having these types of sessions and advising people the types of information to put in a SAR. I always, as simple as it sounds, I talk about the who, what, where, when, why, right? So it's almost cliche-like, but you know exactly what's transpired, and you then need to put that into a suspicious activity report in the most succinct, complete way so that we understand what's happened. So who's involved, where it happened, when it happened, if you understand a bit about why and what's going on, how has money flowed? Is it through wire transfers, credit card, what was used for payment? Those are the kinds of things to include there. If you've undertaken your own review and this is what you did and the conclusions you came to, that's also very useful to understand, well, how did you arrive, where you arrived at in terms of filing the SAR. So what happens when we get a SAR? This is really, I'm going to walk you through the stages of our processing. Every SAR that comes in is given a unique identifier. It's entered into our SAR database. Subjects and reason for suspicion are in. We review for links for previous SARs. So we will then be able to find if we got a previous SAR in, if that went to the police, more than likely this SAR is going to go to the police as well, and we'll be able to link that disclosure to any subsequent disclosures we've made. Every SAR that comes in is reviewed by myself or whoever's acting for me. And what we do is I review the SAR, I give it a priority code, 1 to 4, with 1 being the top priority. We acknowledge the SAR, and then we set about our analysis. So again, we're looking at the who, what, when, where, why, how did it happen, what's going on here, what are the suspicions. We undertake various database searches. We have access to a number of government databases. So we will look for things like immigration, land registry, vehicle licensing. We're trying to get a profile of whether they own land, vehicles, property. Obviously, travel patterns can come into play, and we can reach out to other parties, even if we don't have direct access to information. We can use our powers under Section 42C. We can direct basically anybody to give us information that we believe we need to complete our analysis, not only to the SAR filer, but to a third party as well. Obviously, if we're reaching out to a third party, we don't tell that third party anything about the SAR we've received. We just essentially say we're conducting an analysis. We need this information to assist us in performing that. In the statistics I gave, I told you we made 55 requests to overseas FIUs. So given that in a number of SARs there's an international component, we do have the ability to reach out to an overseas FIU. So let's just say, for example, we've got a SAR on a national from country A. We could go to the FIU in country A and say, we're doing an analysis, we're reviewing, this is the background as we know it. Do you have any suspicious activity reports on this individual or any companies or entities linked to him or her? Are there any ongoing criminal investigations on this person? Those are all highly relevant information for us to factor into our analysis. We then generate an intelligence report that comes to the director for approval. We do have a legal advisor on staff, so if as the director I want to seek legal advice on the way forward on a particular case, I have that resource available. And then ultimately, we can make disclosures to local law enforcement, either RCIPS, Customs, Border Control, Anti-Corruption Commission, to AML, CFT, CFP supervisors that are designated under Section 49 of POCL. So that would include SEMA, DCI, CIPA, and SILPA. There is a specific provision under POCL for us to make disseminations to the Department of International Tax Corporation. We can obviously make disclosures to overseas financial intelligence units. There is also the option that we'll analyze it and we'll form the view that, you know, great, you filed a SAR. We're of the view that it doesn't warrant disclosure. And I want to stress, the fact that a filing is filed NFA, do not lose sight of the fact that your filing adds to the intelligence, because there are many cases where a SAR comes in today and we look back and it reinforces a suspicion from 4 years ago that really didn't meet the threshold, but now this additional information adds to that intelligence that we have, and we go, yes, there have been subsequent developments. This now warrants a disclosure. So even if it's initially no further action, it's in the it goes into our SAR database and is there for intelligence purposes. Once we've closed the case, we'll advise the SAR filer what we've done with it, whether it be a disclosure or no further action. So in preparing for this presentation, I really wanted to try and leave you with some nuggets of information of what might be applicable for your sector. And as I met with Francis this afternoon just to get a quick go-over of what he was going to speak about, and I didn't get a chance to sit down with Justine, but some of these things have already been highlighted, and I'm going to try and expand on them. So the entities that are dealers of precious metals or stones, in my view, some of you are retail jewelry stores. Some of you are what I would call, you're actually dealing in precious metals and stones. People want to buy and sell precious metals or stones with you. It's not just I come in and I buy a piece of designer jewelry. I was going to drop a name, but then that might put me in trouble because, yeah, exactly. I'm glad I didn't say that name. So some of these I think are going to be more applicable for people who are actually dealing in precious metals and stones. But I think some of it is also relevant to what I call retail business. Country geographical risk is key. The reality, and nobody really wants to say that this is an established high-risk list, but there are a couple out there. And Justine cited a couple of publications from Cfatf. I think one's on trading in or dealing in diamonds and one in gold. I had a quick review of those, and there's a lot of useful information in there. Trust me, one of the things we do regularly is read Cfatf reports. I dream of the day when Cfatf issues a report that's less than 30 pages, but it hasn't happened yet. So I read the executive summary, and then I search on keywords. But geographical risk comes up over and over in these types of reports. And I've tried to put a few bullet points here. Well, what does that really mean? So I agree for sure that where your customer is based is important, but where the product you're ultimately buying is being mined, refined, or finished could be a factor. The purchaser or seller, where they're domiciled is a relevant criteria to consider in establishing country or geographical risk. If you're delivering a product somewhere, where you're sending it to is relevant. And the funds being used in the transaction, where are they coming from or being sent to? From a customer risk point of view, I think it's pretty obvious that cash changes the dynamics of a situation. And even the $15,000, I like to remind people that that's in the context of more of a one-off transaction. So I'm of the view that if I go to a jewelry store today and well, let me back up. If I went to a jewelry store on day 1 and did 5,000, came back on day 3, did 5,000, came back on day 7, did 5,000, came back on day 22, did 7,000. It really shouldn't be now that you've exceeded the 15,000. You've got a pattern emerging And if all of those are cash transactions, hopefully you'll have mechanisms in place to be able to identify those patterns. Now, it becomes far more difficult if I'm going to jewelry store 1 with $5,000, jewelry store 2 with $5,000, jewelry store 3 with $5,000, but we'll not discuss that for the purposes of this evening. But cash transactions, I think there's something that you should at least go, oh, it's cash. Just because you have cash doesn't make you a criminal. But if I walk in with $30,000 in cash, that to me would be highly unusual. And I think it depends on the jurisdiction as well. Some jurisdictions are cash heavy, and it's common for people to have large amounts of cash. I'm of the view that that's tailed off significantly. I'm actually going more and more cashless, which is strange for me because I'm kind of old school. I like to have a little bit of cash in my wallet just in case my ATM card doesn't work. Payment by or delivery to third parties. I think third parties are key to factor in here. If for whatever reason your customer is having a third party pay you, or a third party is involved in the delivery of a product, again, it should be something that triggers further questions or some kind of line of inquiry. Depending on the product or service that you offer, that's going to change your customer risk. So, again, someone coming in and buying a watch for $500. Can you buy a watch for $500 anymore? Yeah. Okay. That's very different than you transacting and selling $10 million worth of diamonds. So those are two completely different product lines that you're talking about. We've already touched a little bit on structuring, and so structuring should be something that you should be able to detect patterns of. Gonna close out with counterparty risk, and again, some of you are dealing with counterparties. I don't know the precious metals and stones world that well, and how you evaluate counterparties that you deal with, but some of the red flags identified in a lot of the guidance and documents out there is it should be a red flag if you're dealing with someone who seems to lack industry knowledge. They don't have a place of business, or they don't seem to have the financial means to be conducting the transactions that they want to enter into you with. Again, counterparties that are involved in third parties as payers or recipients, you should query what's the reason why the third party is involved. What's the rationale for it? Does it make sense? If you have cases where your counterparty won't identify who owns them or who controls them, that should be a red flag. It's an established, well, I'll say fact. Cfatf and other bodies have established that criminals use precious metals and stones to launder money and to finance terrorism. You would have a warm time disproving that to those bodies. So I always say to people, particularly on the designated person front, it's highly unlikely that a designated person's going to approach a financial institution or a dealer of precious metals in stones directly. I mean, there is an outside chance, but it's more likely that they're going to use third parties that they own, control, or have certain affiliations with. And to me, that's where it gets really difficult for financial institutions to make those associations, right? But dealing with people who you don't know who ultimately owns them or controls them is a big red flag. Again, you're using cash in a transaction or other non-financial institutions for payment. Again, understanding the rationale for why payment would be that way or would be settled that way. And then and lastly, and this is more of a fraud element, you should be aware of dealing in stolen or fraudulent products, right? So we've seen more of it on the second-hand dealers, where people break into someone's house, steal jewelry, try to pawn it. They're quite happy to sell it for half the real value because, well, hey, I stole it, so it cost me nothing. But again, you'd probably be able to, well, not probably, you'd be able to school me on people dealing in fake gems and stones. What I'd like to leave you with, you need to understand your obligations regarding SAR reporting, and we've already touched on the reporting obligation to the FRA under Section 136. Certainly the environment I'm accustomed to is there's a money laundering reporting officer appointed who is the point of contact within the company or organization for internal SARs to be filed. I would then say that you then need to have robust procedures. I've focused on internal and external reporting, but in order to get there, you need to train your staff to understand what they're actually looking for, why they're doing it. So, I mean, to me, it's one thing to say, oh, this is an obligation under the law, do it. I think it's much better if you understand why you're doing it, what you're trying to prevent, the importance of not only protecting yourself, but the jurisdiction as a whole, I think is imperative, and teaching people what they should be looking for, and what they then need to do if they identify those types of scenarios is key to me to establishing a robust system to counter money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. No questions? Well, thank you very much for being here. Yes, sir.
How long is the SAR process?
It varies.
Once you report
It varies. We basically, our standard turnaround time for priority 1 cases is 35 days, but there are cases where we make instantaneous disclosures to parties. So 35 days may sound like long, but by the time you actually research and gather data and pull everything together, but by and large, when we have a case in front of us where it's pretty much a real-time situation, we will disclose that instantaneously to law enforcement and follow up with a subsequent report.
So if I have a cruise partner who comes off the ship, purchase a piece of jewelry, X amount of cash, I report a SARS, does that clear me of my obligation in reporting?
Certainly on the POCL, there are certain protections afforded to SAR filers. So the obligation under Section 136 is to file a SAR. Now, I think where you need to be careful is the anti-money laundering regulations and other things prescribe other things on you. So I think there was a question earlier about, well, do I do the transaction anyway and file the SAR afterwards? And I'm going to say exactly what everybody says. That's a business decision. What I can tell you is by filing a SAR, you've satisfied your obligations under Section 136. There are other offenses that might arise if you knowingly and willfully facilitate, or if you don't have appropriate KYC procedures and monitoring in place. So with regard to SAR filing a SAR is what Section 136 requires.
I guess this question is then for Ms. Dade. What would, as a retailer, what would you consider appropriate KYC for a cruise ship passenger coming out, giving me $5,000 for a piece of jewelry, or $10,000, for me to be clear? But when you come and do your audit, you see a high transaction. What are you looking for to make sure that I fulfill PCI requirements?
Let me pose the question back to you. As a business person, or you do business on island yourself, and when you go in to do certain business, what are some of the things that that business would ask you to provide to them? I think Francis touched on some of it earlier. You go in, you ask for an ID. That is probably one of the first things that you can ask for. Can I see your ID? You make a decision, you're gonna take a copy of that ID. You don't have to tell them you're gonna take a copy of the ID. And now that I say that, I have to address another question, because this question came up, and I'm not gonna highlight anybody that asked the question about how it conflicts with data protection and what data protection says about you not. But I would have you go back and read section, I know the data protection law is not enacted yet. That will be enacted at the end of September. There's a section 54 in the data protection law that requires you and give reasons why and how you can collect that information. You are required under the anti-money laundering regulations to have this information. So the data protection law recognizes that under the AMLRs, you are required to obtain and disclose the information. So you are protected for law enforcement purposes for collecting that data during the course of your business. Okay, so don't worry about that, because you're required to do that. So that section of the law protects you. But it's the basic things you ask for, their identification. If they have a credit card, you know, you're not gonna get a utility bill or any of that stuff there because you're doing business. Identification. If they have a card, take a copy of the card, take a copy of their identification. That is your starting point. If they give you a large amount of cash, ask for proof where the cash is coming from. Maybe they can show you a bank account, or most people do online banking. They can show you online banking, this is where that cash came from.
As we know, especially in the US, a lot of them like to travel with cash because it's like undeclared money. So they say, oh, I got it off of working on a job site, and the person paid me in cash.
And I go back to the point, you're not going to get rid of all the risks, but what you as the business person do to satisfy yourself that you are comfortable with accepting that cash. Because I cannot stand here and say to you, if this happens, you should not do it. Because I'm your regulator, I can't tell you how to conduct business, yeah? But I'm saying if you have done, get an ID, ask a question, where did this cash come from? And they've given you a satisfactory answer that you feel comfortable with, then go ahead and conduct your business, yeah? But be prepared that once we do come in and we see that transaction and we've asked the question, what did you do? You can provide to us what you did, what questions you asked, what ID you got, or any other information that you may have gotten from the person.
But at the same time too, it leaves myself open to criminal proceedings against me as a business. You can't guarantee that I won't be.
There are mitigating factors, because I'm saying to you, when we do come in to do our audit, and you have done all you can do to mitigate the risk, then we have to take that into account, yeah? But it's when the blatant things happen and you ignore it, and we can show that, is where then we hold you responsible, because you've actually done nothing.
Question for you, I know this is the Diamond Deals, DCI again. What about retail? When it comes to retail?
If you're selling jewelry retail?
No. Retail, that's a normal store, this and that. It's more DCI asks the question. Even regularly in the jewelry stores, the real estate and all that.
Yeah.
What about retail businesses?
That don't sell jewelry and don't do real estate?
That's basic retail.
That has nothing to do with this.
No, what I'm saying is that regulation coming further down the line.
No.
As far as what
You mean if you have a store that sells clothes?
Clothes.
No.
That is not a requirement. That doesn't come within scope. No, that doesn't come within scope. We can't, because it's not, no, it's not something that is being considered.
I'm just asking if it's.
It's not something that is considered. And I'm not gonna say that it is something that will be considered, because, for clothing and so on, Justine probably will.
The focus.
Maybe I can just kind of clarify one thing with respect to why we're talking about, for example, precious metals versus clothes or shoes or furniture or whatnot. What the money launderer wants is to be able to put the cash in and take cash out. If you buy a dress at a store, if you go back to sell it on, even if it's a really nice dress, you have to find a buyer, it's worth like a tenth of the price, and
That's different.
right, yeah, and so basically the bank is the gatekeeper in this, right, in this instance, and also, I mean, obviously
right.
the law enforcement arm, so not regulator, but the law enforcement arm would be the one.
Because, I mean, if, for example, if you have a drug dealer who is opening a store and buying clothes, using their money to buy clothes to sell in their store, that comes under a whole different umbrella under the proceeds of crime law, which is not covered by the money laundering regulations. So the police will take care of that aspect. So if it's drug money and then they're laundering the drug money by buying clothes and selling that, the police takes on that investigation under a different law.
Question. What's the time frame to file this as, for example, just
As soon as practicable. So what I tell people, and
With a
jurisdiction.
year later.
Jurisdictions come under fire for this, because if Cfatf had their way, they'd want you to specify a period or to say immediately. We've gone with practicable because we understand that there's certain logistics. So most institutions, again, dealing more in sort of like a banking environment, banks will establish a time frame within which the MLRO has to make a determination of what to do with an internal SAR that they filed. And I think it's quite reasonable that if something comes to your attention, and you have to, depending on the situation, you may need to make further inquiries. You have to be practical and always be thinking, well, I am on the clock, because when you write up your SAR, or sorry, not write, let me not type up your SAR, because some people still do write. You are part of the evaluation is going to be, well, how quickly was the SAR filed? So if you became aware of adverse information, how long did it take you to become aware of that? How long did it take you to? So if you don't have a good explanation for the delays involved in submitting a SAR, that's something that your supervisor may say, well, that's an area of improvement, or depending on how severe it is.
Because a lot of times you may have cruise ship customers that you may think, might have suspicious activity, but they're gone by the time
Yeah.
3 o'clock, right? Even when it's brought to our attention.
So again, if a scenario like that arises, and let's just say after the fact you determine that it's suspicious, then you say just that. This was a cruise ship passenger on day whatever, following when my accounting department was clearing it or whatever, this is what we discovered, da-da-da-da-da-da, this is what then led to the suspicion. Again, just because they're gone doesn't mean that the information isn't useful, because let's just say they're a national from jurisdiction X. We can tell jurisdiction X what they did here, and jurisdiction X might actually have other information on them, and they may be under surveillance investigation for other things. So the legalese is as soon as practicable.
One of the things that we will consider from DCI as a regulator is the reasonable action, the reasonable test. What would a reasonable person do? Would a reasonable person wait 6 months after, or a year later? We can consider on a normal cruise ship day, there's like 6, 7 cruise ships out there. Can we really reasonably expect you to be able to do a SAR
after every sale that you suspect is suspicious. It's not realistically gonna happen, yeah? But if, when I come in, or one of my team come in to do the test, okay, why did you wait 3 months? Why did you wait 6 months? And depending on the explanation, then we apply the test, the reasonable test to that. And a lot of things that we think about is
Okay.
the normal person. What would a normal person do? Yeah, so that's the test we put to it.
Last couple of questions.
Suppose someone comes in with $100 bills, all smelling of marijuana, like you mentioned, could be nothing. $20,000, buy some inventory, goes away, you file a SAR. Could he get he would get investigated based on the SAR, right? That's basically the simple.
He could, in that scenario though, I would be encouraging you to also call the police directly. Because if someone comes in with 20 grand smelling like marijuana, I think filing a SAR whilst, and the police and the FRA sometimes don't agree on this. I would tell you need to do both. The police will tell you just to call them, but I will then never know about that event. The FRA may have information in its database on that person that, so, but in a scenario like that, I would tell you to call the police and file a SAR.
Okay, so this brings my next question. Does that SAR include witness protection program?
SARs can't be used as evidence.
SARs cannot be used as evidence.
What do you mean?
SARs are intel.
But
If
the
you
guy's
call,
gonna know.
if
He's
you,
gonna know.
no, if you call the
Right? He's
police,
gonna know if he didn't do any other transactions except that transaction.
No, but I'm
something
saying,
led to him
let's
being
understand the
investigated.
difference.
He's gonna, then his brothers are gonna come and
Let's
kill their
understand the
family and
difference.
all, you know,
Let's
where's the
understand,
protection? You're
one
basically-
second, please, let's
This
understand
is
the
basically
difference.
like a lot of snitching, which is great, I understand that.
Let's-
But
Claudia,
where's
just
the
let it go.
protection for the people who are giving out all this information? There's nothing. Can't-
There is,
So, sorry, wait, let me just finish. So my point is that, yes, this is all amazing and all the work you guys do is fantastic, but I think that the more that you publicize and, because the bad guys know this is happening too, so this is a huge deterrent, which is great, but there's still always gonna be the people who are saying, look, I'm not gonna put my life at risk because some guy has cash.
Well, there is actually a duress provision in the proceeds of crime law, but I would tell you to tread carefully.
Yeah,
So,
right, but you understand. that-
I understand. I'm the head of an FRA. When I walk my dog at night,
Yeah,
I look around.
yeah, I know.
So,
and coming to you, ma'am, there is something that is called, or the police refer to it as crime in action. And you can call and make that report because something is happening then and there. Now, if you are concerned about your safety, that is something that the police can take into account, yeah? There's different ways of giving evidence. You can give evidence by video link. You can give evidence anonymously. There are different ways,
He's still
but
gonna
I'm
know.
saying,
He's gonna know where it came from.
at the end of the day, though, think back as to section 136 about your obligation that if you suspect that there is a crime or something that you need to report, you have an obligation to report it. And you, long and short of it, you have an obligation under the law. If at some point you are approached as to why you have not done this, you have given an explanation, we have to then give the reasonable test as whether or not your explanation is satisfactory enough to not bring any charges against you. And those are things that would have to be considered. I'm not saying to you that you may not be held liable for not doing it, but it's things that has to be considered. Okay? Ma'am?
What if you bought an item for resale and while having the rightful owner comes in, sees it, and identifies the genuine or any
That is a direct report to the police because you now have stolen property in your possession. So you report that directly to the police. So if you are, for example, a secondhand dealer that you trade in or you buy jewelry, for example, there are certain obligations under the secondhand dealer's law that you call the police and they can take possession of the item that is suspected stolen, etc., etc. But straight to the police. That is stolen property in your possession.
I was about to say, Section 136 clearly states that if you know or suspect or have reasonable grounds for knowing or suspecting that someone is engaged in criminal conduct and that information came to you in the course of a regulated business or in your profession, you are obligated to file a SAR. Now again, if a police officer was here, they'd tell you that that's not what the SAR regime is set up for. I am telling you as the director of the FRA that you need to carefully look at your SAR file and obligations. So in that situation, if I were you, and this is a personal opinion from R.J. Berry, I would call the police, report the stolen property, and I would file a SAR. Because when your supervisor comes in and you say, I made a report to the police, they could ask you about whether you filed a SAR. So if I were you, and I shouldn't say this, but if I were you, that's exactly what I'd do. I'd call the police first, report it, and this is what a number of MLROs do. They file SARs and say, this has been reported directly to the police. And one of the things we say to them, if you've already reported it to the police and you know which officer is dealing with it, put that in your SAR as well, because we can then reach out to them, because we may have additional information that you don't know about that we can tell the police. But if you never filed the SAR with us and the police never ask us, we could have intelligence sitting there that's nobody knows about.
Why is he pointing at me when he says that?
I'm just, there was a question about MLROs do have personal liability. So an MLRO can face, I believe, civil and criminal penalties for failing to discharge their responsibilities.
The police responsibility is not to file a SAR. They will do the criminal investigation.
They're not under an obligation to contact me. We have a close working relationship, and they know that they can reach out to us in any scenario or in an investigation that they're conducting.
I know it's
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions. It was a pleasure speaking to you. I look forward to the next time.
Thank you, RJ. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's a bit late. It's 10 to 8. We did say we're going to go on until 8, but I think all the questions you've asked and all the information that is being shared here is very important. So just indulge with us a little more. So, and I promise you that I will get through my presentation quickly, because a lot of the things that is actually on my presentation was touched on before in either Justine's, RJ's, or Francis's presentation. So on those areas, I will probably go over really quickly. Okay. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Claudia Brady. I'm the head of compliance and enforcement at Department of Commerce and Investment, your regulator. So now you know us, and I'm going to introduce the team. In the back, I have Jessie Melbourne, assistant head of compliance and enforcement, because at some point you will get an email or correspondence from one of us, so you need to know who we are, okay? I have Stephanie Suku, who is the senior compliance officer. I know you've all received some email or another from her in the last couple of months. Please don't be mad with her. She's just doing her job, and the law requires her to do that. Over here, I have Ruben Foster, who is the next senior compliance officer. So out of the 4 of us, once you send your communication, then you will likely get an email from one of the 4 of us. More than likely one of them, as opposed to me. You might get a one-off from me, or probably some of you have gotten a letter with my signature on it. Don't hold it against me either. I'm doing my job too. Okay. So what I want to encourage with those letters, even though you've gotten them, communication is the key for us. We really, really want you to communicate with us as much as possible. Any questions or anything that you think may be frivolous, communicate. We will try our best to answer the questions. We'll try our best to guide you as much as we can. That is what we are here for. Don't think that because we are your regulator, the only thing that we're thinking of is coming in and fining you and penalizing you. Our objectives to start with is to get you compliant so that the country in a whole can become compliant. And the only way we can do that is if we communicate with each other. What are the problems you're having? What help do you need from us? Yeah, we're not going to tell you how to operate your business, but we will guide you as to how you can do what needs to be done. So when we have these sessions, don't go away and just forget about us. Send us emails, call us. Any questions you have, if you want to have a private meeting with either one of us, request that. We will sit and help you through the process as much as we can. Because at the end of the day, our objective is to make you compliant, okay? So that we don't go on the gray list. We don't want that. I don't know if some of you may know about, 20 years ago or so that we were actually blacklisted, and it was complete panic. We want to prevent that from happening. So let me see if I can touch on any of the questions that you have. Someone asked about if you're not registered with DCI. I'm going to be covering that in the slide. What happens if I did business with someone who was later found out to be a criminal, but at the time of doing business, I didn't know anything? I think RJ touched that, where depending on when you found out and the suspicion was there, you file a SAR. Don't wait 6 months later. If you don't know, you don't know. If you form the suspicion after and you want to file a SAR, file the SAR. Okay, but at least the information will be there. Someone asked, if I sold a watch to someone for $20,000 and did no checks because they used a credit card, am I going to be penalized? And credit cards are regulated through the banks. Now, you did no checks, but what due diligence did you do? If that person's give you a credit card, did you ask for an ID? Does the ID match with the credit card? If you just take the credit card, because when I go into Foster's and I'm buying groceries for $100, they want to see my credit card. And as annoying, I go to Foster's regularly and I keep saying to the ladies, you know me, I'm in here every week. No, we want to see your credit card. They're doing their due diligence, and I have to tell myself, they're ensuring that I am not using someone else's credit card, okay? So saying that they had a credit card and credit cards are regulated through the banks, you as a business have your own personal responsibility to do your own due diligence. You cannot rely on someone else to do it for you. Because if you're relying on another entity to do your due diligence for you, you don't know what type of due diligence that bank or that other business is doing. They may have missed something that you likely could pick up. So you yourself have that particular obligation. So don't rely on anyone else to do it for you. Okay? I think the question on the MLRO was covered. Your personal obligation under 136 of the Proceeds of Crime Law, it's a criminal charge. If you know or suspect that a criminal offense is being committed and you do not report it, that is where you can be charged. Okay? Can you come to our office? Sure, we'll come to your office. Just let us know where you are. I'll give you the email address after. Can I get this information online? That was a question. DCI is in the process of redesigning its website. We're going to have a particular, or there is already a page on there for DNFBPs. And a lot of this information will be going on that website. So it will be available to you. We haven't done the official launch of the website yet, but once we do, you will get the information. That's why it's important for us to have updated phone numbers and email addresses, because a lot of our communication will be through emails. Yes, we can come to your office. How can you reach out to more businesses? I think this is so important. What can we do to ensure more people attend? Well, this session this evening was only for dealers in precious metals and stones specifically, and I think that's why it's such a small number. We are doing another session in a couple of weeks, and that will be for real estate, because I think it was Francis earlier that talked about the numbers of dealers in the 2015 NRA was about 36. That number has decreased. Whether or not businesses have closed or people have changed what they're doing, but the number is less. Okay, so I'm really very pleased to see so many of you out here today, because we really didn't expect such a large number, because it was like pulling teeth, because this process is very new to all of you. And I think a lot of people were scared because of lack of information. And now that the information is going out, people are becoming more aware, and people are more reaching out to DCI and coming to more of these sessions. So we had sessions in May, we had one in 2017, we had one in July. We're having 2 this month. So when we come to your office and we leave pieces of paper inviting you, or we send you annoying emails, please respond to them. We send Eventbrite. We want you to respond to them, to come to these sessions, because hopefully everything that was talked about today was of some value to each of you. We know it's a task going forward, but we all have our role to play for the overall success of the country, and that is what we're really aiming for. Okay? So talk to your friends that are involved in precious metals and stones, your friends that are doing real estate. And I think that's the best way to get information around in Cayman. Marl Road, right? Speak to each other. Tell them about this. Let them call. Tell them not to be scared of us. We're not just going to, always fine you. If you're non-compliant, we likely would if you don't communicate with us. But tell your friends, tell your family if they're involved in this kind of business, okay? So, with that said, I'm going to try and do my bit. Now, what does DCI expect from you? It may seem like an enormous task to some of you, especially those of you that are small businesses. And we are very cognizant of the fact that if you're a small business, it will seem like something that I cannot do. That's why we're here. Come and ask us about how you can do this. What does the law say? How is the best way to do this? And we will walk you through the process, right? But what we're going to go through today really is the DCI's role as the supervisor, the expectations from you, and like I say, some of it was covered in previous presentation. If it was, I'm just going to go over it quickly. The DCI supervisory regime, the inspections, the on-site and the off-site inspections, the enforcement, the warning letters, the fines, and then the summary we're going to go over. So you hear a lot about POCL, Proceeds of Crime Law, because with AML and financing of terrorism, we will kill you with acronyms. So if you don't understand the acronyms, please let us know, okay? So we can cover it as best as possible. But when we say POCL, we mean the Proceeds of Crime Law, which is our overarching primary law, which is the criminal responsibility as it relates to your actions when it comes to anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. Then we have the anti-money laundering regulations, which we refer to as the AMLRs, another acronym. That is mainly the regulation DCI uses when it comes to do regulation of you. What are the expectations under the anti-money laundering regulations? And then we have something that is called the guidance notes. The guidance notes really is a supplement for the anti-money laundering regulations to sort of go down in more minute details as to what you need to do to satisfy the money laundering regulations. We have completed our guidance notes specifically for your sector and real estate, those who we supervise, and that will be released very soon. It is a large document, but we are also doing other guidance that will help you to understand the guidance notes. In particular, we are completing the guidance as to how you conduct your risk assessment and how you put your AML CFT framework. So AML, when you hear me say AML, is anti-money laundering, and CFT is countering the financing of terrorism. Okay? So you will have your guidance notes soon. So DCI as the regulator, the background. The main purpose of us becoming the regulator is to establish an atmosphere in which RE and DPMS, which means real estate and dealers in precious metals and stone, act responsibly and implement adequate internal systems and controls. That's what we are looking for. To support the development of a common understanding of DCI risk-based supervision for AML, CFT, and all of those acronyms: anti-money laundering, countering financing of terrorism, targeted financial sanctions, and proliferation, we can never call that, proliferation financing. And Justine touched on that earlier. And we are here to provide guidance to the supervised industry on applying the risk-based approach. I know Francis talked about it. I think Justine as well talked about it. What is the risk to you? To highlight the risk factors specific to your sector and suggest mitigation strategies that fit with the particular activities and businesses of RE and DPMS. That is those are the reasons why we were really designated to become your regulator, to ensure that these things are happening. So the objective really is to implement strategies to manage and mitigate money laundering and terrorist financing activities through a mixture of deterrence. You conducting business, how do you deter persons from using your business to launder money or for any other nefarious reasons? Are you conducting the appropriate due diligence? Yeah? The objective also is how to detect. How are you as a business monitoring what is happening in your business, and are you filing suspicious activity report when you have identified or suspect something? So these are all internal things that you have to do. And how are you doing with your record keeping? Because when we do come in as your regulator, we do not just ask for activities or transactions that took place today or last week. Under the AMLRs, you are required to keep the information for a number of years. So we can come in and do an assessment or an inspection of your system and ask you for things 3 years prior. Now, I know some of you are looking at me like, where are we going to keep all this paper? You will have to sit and decide within your business what is the most appropriate or practical for you to keep your records. But you cannot say to us when we come in to do an inspection, I only have space to keep things for a year, so I shredded everything for the last 4 years. That is not going to satisfy anybody. Okay? We will accept scanned copies. Once you have it, if you have an electronic way of keeping that information, and you can provide us the information when we ask for it, that is what is important. Yeah. Proportionate procedures designed based on assessed risk. What do you have in place? What is the proportionate procedure you have? Have you identified higher risk areas, and what do you do when you identify higher risk areas? So for example, if you're conducting business with someone from one of those countries that are considered high risk, I don't want to say Iraq because they're sanctioned. Probably a country from the Middle East that some people may consider high risk, and I don't want to pick on the Middle East, but there may be news articles that you may see that will point out that maybe it's a high risk area. What are you doing within your business to mitigate that? Are you conducting enhanced customer due diligence checks and enhanced transaction monitoring if you have identified that you are conducting business from higher risk areas? Now, this is not only for selling, it's for also dealing. So if you are buying your jewelry from an area that is considered high risk, and a lot of you know about Africa and the blood diamonds and those sorts of things, are you buying your jewelry from your stones from Africa, which is considered a high risk? And what are you doing to mitigate that? And really, you shouldn't be buying that. Because are they part of the Kimberley process? I don't think so. Now, in relation to lower risk areas, you can make a decision. Are you doing simplified or reduced controls? But you then have to identify what you consider a low risk area and be able to explain to your regulator why you consider that a low risk area. So what do we expect? All supervised entities to identify all applicable money laundering terrorist financing risks. Assess the risk presented by the RE and or DPMS. So once you've identified your risk, have you assessed your risk? Who are your customers? And I think this was covered before on all the other presentations. Have you done an assessment on your customers, your products and services, where they're from, the delivery channels? Is it all cash that they're doing their business in? You know, is it numerous credit cards that they're doing their business in with? You have to understand, are you doing a risk assessment of that? And then you're required to design and introduce controls to manage and reduce these risks. So your business can make a decision to say, the Middle East is high risk. Our internal control is going to be, we're not going to do any business from people who are coming from these jurisdictions. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just saying it's an example. Or if someone comes in to do strictly cash, you may make a decision that we will not accept cash. In some jurisdictions, it is highlighted all over the jewelry store. If you are paying with cash, we require ABC from you. So the moment someone comes in to do a transaction and they know they're paying with cash, the notice is there, we require all of these things from you, and by law we require it. That's just how some jurisdictions handle it. We don't do it that way, but then it's a business decision if you're going to do it that way. Monitor and improve controls where necessary. This is really important because some businesses will have one procedure in place for 10 years and it never ever gets changed or analyzed to say if our business have evolved, we cannot continue to use the same process. So if you're having, say, when you started your business, you did all credit card transactions and you had certain controls in place for that. And then all of a sudden your business is becoming more cash-based. Have you reviewed your processes to see if it still applies or you need to improve on it? Because when we do come in and we do the on-site, and you show us the way your business is operating, and we say, well, what controls do you have in place? Well, we had something that we used in 1970. Does that apply now? Likely not. And then it's likely that a lot of activity or illegal activity has gone on in your business because you have not taken the time to now monitor or improve the controls you have in place. So it's important to know how your business operates and know how you need to make improvements if it needs be. And I think it's not only business places that do that. We as government department, when we are operating, we do not continue to operate with the same controls year after year after year. Just think about laws that revised regularly. The government realized that things change, so we then have to change laws to become effective. If you are not doing this, how effective are you at preventing money laundering or terrorist financing? How does it apply to you? All REs and DPMS should implement a risk-based anti-money laundering compliance program reflective of its unique risk profile. I can say every business in here operates differently. You have different ways of collecting your cash. You have different ways of displaying your jewelry, different ways of taking IDs, different ways of doing your banking. None of you are the same. So it is important that you implement a risk-based compliance program that is reflective of your profile. Do not, you may have a friend who also has a jewelry store and you want to take their manual and use in your store when in fact their risk is different from your risk. That will not work. It's what is your risk. RE and DPMS risk profile should take into account the inherent risk in the products and services it offers, the customers it serves, the geographic location it operates in, and the delivery channels. I think we covered that in the previous slide. RE and DPMS process should be logical. It should identify, monitor, and manage the risk to the businesses that could be used for money laundering. And I just spoke of that. So we expect you to develop a risk-based approach to AML and CFT. Identify your risk. Who are your customers? What business do you do? What's the product? What's the service you provide? What is your delivery channels, the locations and countries? Because some dealers have locations in different countries. Yeah? Analyze the risk. What is the likelihood and chance the risk will happen in your business? You have to make that determination. We cannot for you, because this is your daily activity. You know what is happening in your business. What is the impact to your business if something that is risky happens within your business? What kind of loss or damage would you face? If you do not do your risk assessment, analyze it. Yeah? And manage the risk. Review the risk. And if you notice, the cycle doesn't stop. It's continuous. Because like I say, everything will change in your business daily, monthly, yearly. It is your responsibility. Something will happen in your store likely, and you will say, you know what, that is something that I never thought of. That is a risk to me. Yeah? This is just delving more into the last slide. It looks a little complicated, but it talks about identifying your risk. What can happen, how and why, when and where, going back to RJ's who, what, where, when. Analyze the risk. Determine the likelihood and consequences, the risk level. What is the risk level to you? Is it high, medium, low? And evaluate your risk. and what you're going to put in place to mitigate that risk. And that comes in the part of treat your risk. So it is very important that you understand your business, how it's operating, and what is the risk to you. And in summary, measures to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing in line with risk identified. Have you put any measures in place to identify this, and what measures have you put in place? What is your risk management process? Because these are questions we're going to ask you when we do ask for an on-site, or if we ask for a desktop. If I can just go back and explain that. When you do your registration, and it's a little bit of it is on another slide, what we do is we do something within our office that is called a risk analysis. So based on what you place on your questionnaire of the controls you have in place, the manuals you have, the training your staff has done, we do a risk profile on you, and you either come up high risk, medium risk, or low risk. From that, we determine if we're going to do what we call a desktop review of you, which is when we write a letter to you and say, provide to the department all these documents. History of your training, your manual, your risk assessment, a number of things that we will ask for. And we will sit in our office and we analyze all of this, and we will determine, okay, you have all the controls that you need to have in place. We do not necessarily have to come and do an on-site for you. 6 months later or a year later, we may come back out to you and say, can you give us an update on this information? If we come back 6 months later and realize you have done no training, you have done no sort of reviewing of your process, or you've filed no SARs, or we will then review again and say, well, maybe we need to visit this person. Because clearly, if you are conducting business with a high level of turnover when it comes to finances, and you are not doing any risk assessment or continuous training with your staff, how are they going to identify any issues that could be happening in their presence? So we may come to do an on-site. Now, when we've done the risk assessment and you have been identified as high risk, which means you have literally nothing in place, we will then come and do an on-site of you, and we will be asking all of these questions, and may likely disrupt your business, which is the last thing we want to do. Because if we come in to do an assessment, we'll try our best not to disrupt your business. But if we do not have any communication from you and we just turn up at your business with no notice, we're the last people you want to see, because that is disrupting you. Okay? That's why I say it's so important for you to communicate with us. Identification and addressing of high-risk areas. Flexible efforts to fight money laundering and terrorist financing. Better adaptability to money laundering and terrorist financing methods across both industries. Why do we supervise? To ensure zero regulatory risk. DCI will leverage its risk-based AML approach and supervise entities for the following. Do you have a compliance program? How effective are your current policies and procedures? Because we are being tested on this as well. So when we come in and ask for this, if we cannot satisfy the FATF or the CFATF that we have done this properly, our department fails. And by extension, that can tie into the country's failure. What is your reporting process? Do you have a specific process within your business that all your staff knows what to do? Because it's not very positive if we come in, speak to your frontline clerk, and that clerk does not know anything about the reporting process, which goes into the area of how much are you training your staff. We're going to look for the SARS reporting, record retention, training program and awareness. Have you had an independent audit done? Because you cannot audit yourself. Please don't, because you will not identify what your issues are. How is it conducted? Many of you may have gotten an email or a letter or something, or saw something in the newspaper on the news. You are required to register with the DCI. We had registration for RE and DPMS, which closed on the 29th of May. There are some that did not register. We still encourage you to register. However, there may be a penalty. I'm not going to say there is not going to be one. We now have the registration of the property developers ongoing, and that closes end of October. We then do the risk rating once you are registered, and then we decide if we're going to come and do an on-site or if we're going to do a desktop off-site review of your processes. And then we monitor you, and we administer enforcement actions if necessary. Now, someone was asking earlier about if you have not registered. We're going to talk about the penalties now. What we would normally do is send a warning letter to you to say you have not registered and action may likely be taken against you. And I'm going to tell you what is in the law as it relates to your fine. A minor breach carries a fine of $5,000. No negotiating, $5,000. That is what the fine for a minor breach is. There are specific things within the AMLRs that are considered minor breaches. I don't have the chart in front of me now, but I will encourage all of you to look at the AMLRs if you get the chance. A serious breach, which is where non-registration comes in. So if you have not registered, it is considered a serious breach of the AMLRs. It carries a fine of $50,000, up to $50,000 for a sole trader, and $100,000 for a company for non-registration. For those that are considered very serious breaches, sorry, remind me, Jesse, is non-registration under serious or very serious? Serious? Yeah. So very serious breaches under Section 55S4 carries a fine of $100,000 for a sole trader and up to $250,000 for a company. And I think this will highlight to you how very serious the government considers this whole process. Because we have to understand that non-compliant by the country to not meet the expectations of the international requirements is a serious impact on our financial center on operations within Cayman. Because when we are either blacklisted or gray listed, your well-being goes away, pretty much. And that is what we're trying to prevent. So sometimes we might be a bit harsh, or it may seem like we are harsh. It's not that we want to be, but we have an obligation. And we want you to also become compliant. So do not sit and ignore us. There is also a summary conviction which may lead to a $500,000 fine and an indictment to a fine plus 2 years imprisonment. So If you are fined under the AMLRs, you can also be charged criminally and taken to court. And that is the judge's discretion to decide if he or she is going to fine you up to $500,000 or send you to prison. So it is a very serious matter. And I hope this gets the message across. So work with us. We're willing to work with you. Work with us to meet our obligations, and work with us to also meet your obligations as much as possible. This is the communication for us, enforcement@dci.gov.ky. If you have any questions as it relates to what I've talked about here today, the website is dci.gov.ky, and like I've said, we're going to slowly start to evolve into the new website, which will have all of this information, because we do have a DNFBP page. No question is silly. Okay? Some of you did ask me today about registration and whether or not we will help you. We will always help you. Just reach out to us. If you are having a problem, if we've requested from you a desktop and you need extra time, let us know you need extra time. Usually we will give you that extra time, but don't just ignore us, because the next thing we will do is come and fine you, which is what we don't want. Any questions? Yes, Mr. Rankin. Timeline. Well, if you are a real estate or a dealer, your time for registration has passed. Well, when we do come in, say we've asked for a desktop and we've identified certain areas of weaknesses, we will usually reach out to you and say, this is your area of weakness. We will usually give you, depending on how serious the matter is, a time in which to get everything in place. So we might do 6 months, we might do 3 months, depending on your specific business and how much you are missing and what needs to be done. There are certain businesses that it is so serious that we cannot continue to allow you to operate. And we may just say, because we do license you as well under the DCI umbrella, we can suspend your license and say you cannot operate until this is done. But it depends on each business and case by case, depending on how much time you might need, and we will give you time, and we will come back and do a second inspection. And how much have you done since we last came? You need 3 more months or you need 2 more months, but don't let us come after 2 months and nothing has happened. Okay? There was a question over here before I get to.
I have a question about the independent audit. If you have an internal audit function that's separate, can you rely on them to conduct that? Or do you have to go to like an external party?
It is best. I would recommend probably an external, because that's an independent person not reviewing your own processes. So I would.
Would you recommend that take place?
Well, it really depends on your business and how often you would think that that audit will be necessary. We will normally, if we say ask for a desktop and everything is fine, we will come in 6 months later and ask you to provide. You can decide to do it in a year. You can decide to do it 6 months, depending on what feedback you've gotten from us to say these are areas of weaknesses. You could consider to do an audit and then implement whatever needs to be implemented internally to address the areas that were identified. So I cannot tell you once a year. You make that decision based on what you find.
Sorry, I just want to make just a minor correction in earlier on the statement of $15,000. There was a change in the regulations as of the middle of July 18th to it now being 10,000. So the threshold is now 10,000. And I was aware of that because that was one of the criticisms that was highlighted in the report, because the standard is calling for either $10,000 euros or 15,000 US dollars. So our 15,000 CI is higher than
when we did our retail evaluation in 2007, the euro was much, much stronger. And therefore, we can see because of the euro, we are compliant. Because it's euro or US, 15,000. So we had to make a change to
Thanks, Francis. I know now that it's getting late, but one of the questions that came up was, can we do this monthly? I've shown you the team. There's 4 of us. We're hoping to increase in staff at some point because we do have probably almost 300, probably about almost 300 entities that we are supervising. So we want to at least try to do, this is the beginning stages. So we're going to do as many outreach as we can do. We may, after, all of the excitement is over, say we will do this every quarter, but it also depends on your feedback as well. What do you think you need? How often do you need this? And that's why the feedback sheets that you have is important. You don't have to fill it out here today. You can, as long as you promise me you're going to send it in. I know all of you that attended, I'll come to your store and ask for it. Okay? So the feedback sheet is important for us to know, what do we need to do for you? Okay? How often we need to do this? What areas we need to specifically focus on to help you to be able to put your processes in place, be effective and compliant with law. Because we also have to ensure that we are effective as a regulator. And how our effectiveness is going to be tested is how well all of you do when it comes to your inspections and the processes that you have in place. So if we can go back and report that we have 75 dealers in precious metals and stones and 60 of them have policies and they have all of their training, that looks good for us. But if we go back and say 0, it shows that we are not effective in our effectiveness of how we are regulating you and helping you. Okay? So that's why I say no questions are foolish. Any request you have of us, we'll find a way to help you with it. We just won't tell you how to do your business because we don't want to tell you what manuals you're going to use and then we're going to come in and inspect that manual and find all sorts of faults with it because then you're going to blame us. Okay? So let's work together as much as we can. There's another question.
There was a question here about how is a store vulnerable?
What business are you involved in? It depends. So I think maybe what we have talked about, depending if you are, what sort of jewelry are you selling? High-end jewelry. Are you taking cash? Are you not taking identification? Are you not doing your risk assessment? In any way, your store can be vulnerable. Okay? I know it's getting warm because the AC usually goes off at 8 o'clock, I think. So we'll get you out here as quick as possible. Any other questions? I hope this afternoon was useful. I know we kept you long, but we actually fed you, right? So you can't blame us, right? So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, and be in touch with us, okay? Thank you for coming.